Hello. I wanted to do a video on competitions. Yet another video on competitions. How do I preface this? One of the reasons why I used to, one of the many reasons why I feel it's very important to go to competitions with my students, and to occasionally even go to ones that I'm not involved in. What is that? Is that it's a little less now that open marking isn't there, but I can watch an event of skaters and kind of estimate where their marks are based on what I've read, my knowledge of the scoring criteria in different categories, and then check the results, check that against the results, and see how accurate my assessments are. Um, because it's kind of irrelevant what my opinion of how my kids should be skating, where they should be placing, and what their scores should be are in competition if it's not in line, exactly in line with what the judges in the area think. And it's important to realize that in different areas, the judges will have slightly different opinions, different ways of marking, different idiosyncrasies to their judging, different judging scores. So when you go from a Nova Scotian competition to an Ontario competition to a Quebec competition to an Alberta competition, with the exact same program, the exact same skate, you are not going to get the exact same transcripts. You're going to get things marked a little differently in different areas, based on interpretation, local interpretation, and largely local interpretation, but somewhat individual interpretation as well. So one of the things I like to see is how accurate I am. Now, in this past competition I just did, and in pretty much every other competition, my estimates on how my kids are going to do and how they're going to score are right on. This competition, I had a kid in senior bronze CPC who I told her program, I said average between 12 and 15 points in practice. And it was kind of climbing up, and I told her that I expected her to be, max 15, but hopefully around 15 if she skated decently at the competition. She skated decently at the competition. She had a couple little stumbles, and her score was 14.91, which is right on my estimate. And I don't think parents are aware of how rare it is to be able to to preconceive how my kids are going to score at competitions. I also said to her that if she scores around 15, she should be around middle of the pack. Now, after she skated, my emotional reaction to how well she skated, and causes you to lose a little bit of subjectivity. And I changed my reaction to how I thought she would place, but it turns out my initial objective reaction a couple days before, a week before, was correct. Anyway, I wanted to go through the process of how I figure out how my kids are going to skate in competitions, what their scores are going to be, and where they're going to place before they even get to a competition. Because I've had conversations like this with other coaches, and a lot of coaches say things to their kids and parents, and even to me, other coaches saying, "Oh, I have no idea how my kid's going to do. I don't know what their score is going to be." And then they get a score after the event, and they're absolutely confused at how they got that score. They just don't get it, and they either agree with it, or they get angry and kind of defensive and backpedal, rather than trying to analyze and figure out and learn from the situation. I know that in Labrador, the first 2 or 3 years we did CPC in Newfoundland, I would request in advance to meet with the scoring panel of the events Emily was in, after every event she did at sectionals. So I would meet with them, and I would have a list of questions on why she was scored this way, why she was scored that way, and then get a response from the controllers, I think they're called, technical specialists, who actually have a lot more impact on the overall score than the judges. I guess that's debatable, but somewhat. Anyway, and so I've had a conversation with some coaches about how I knew exactly how my kids were going to score. I knew exactly how they were going to skate. I had everything set up, so I knew what was going to happen at the competition. And I was called, I was basically told by most coaches that I was bullshitting and didn't know what I was talking about. And yet, 6 years in a row of CPC, my kids get, pretty much exactly the score that I said. And I can predict their score 6, 9, 12 months in advance at every competition. and I wanted to go through the process with the parents of how I do that. It's not because I'm a witch. It's not because I'm what we call it, precog. But it kind of seems like it because I'm taking together dozens of different aspects of their skating and forming it into a probability chain that ends up kind of telling me exactly how they're going to do in competitions, which is one of the reasons why the vast majority of my kids, I know how they're going to do in competition. I know how they're going to skate. I know how they can place. I know how they cannot place. And I can usually tell that, the longest prediction I ever made was about 14 months. I said in 14 months you will place here with this score at this competition, and I was right. I've never been wrong with my predictions, although I'm going to go into that too because some people don't quite understand what I mean by that. So I have a dirty whiteboard, which won't come clean for some reason. And I'm going to try to, because I have to illustrate most of this. There's no way for me to explain it. I've never actually tried to explain it fully to anyone, even to coaches. They don't quite get it. So I'm going to see if I can explain it to you guys. Maybe I should push this off to the side here. So this takes out the whole camera. All right. And I don't want to give away any coaching secrets of mine, but most of this is simply analysis. It has nothing to do with the coaching. The coaching is different. This is kind of the formula I use, the calculations I use to figure out how my kids are going to skate in competition. So what ends up happening is, let's use a fake score. Let's say you have a CPC score of 1 to 10, a scale. Oh, I gotta write everything backwards for the camera, don't I? Oh well, you'll figure it out. And let's say I have a program that I choreograph and all the elements are given marks. So let's say I know that the max program we're gonna get is 10. That's how I've kind of designed the program to be. That's where it should be if it's skated perfectly. So then you go through the point of, you start doing run-throughs of the solo. And you start doing run-throughs, normal run-throughs. Let's say the girl I'm doing has 1, 2, 3. And the run-throughs tend to be fairly inconsistent. But they also tend to gradually improve over time and go up over time. With virtually every kid I've ever seen. I've very rarely had kids that just can't figure out the consistency. And the really easy to predict kids end up having a really clear path of improvement as they go along. But this is more, why is that light in there? Arg. Yeah, live with it. So what happens is I then add up the scores. So if here I'm around 5.5, 4.5, and it goes on and on and on. Usually we do about 15 to 20 run-throughs before a competition where I'm actually trying to keep some kind of mental score of what they're skating. And it eventually gets to the point where it levels off. If I have enough lessons and enough preparation time, eventually it gets to the point later on where you start having less and less variation in their scores and it starts kind of following a pretty normal path. So what I do is basically with the last 10 programs, and it depends on the kid, but the last 10 programs I say, okay, the worst score you possibly got of those last 10 programs is 9.6. The best score I would have ever given you is 10.3. So that's your range that you can expect in competitions, assuming you skate your solo the way you've been skating it every time for the last week or so. That seems pretty logical, right? And basically, again, everyone basically follows this path. They have a little bit of inconsistency while they're learning the solo, and it gradually gets better and better and better. And then if it's designed to be a 10-point program, it gets closer and closer, and more the average gets to 10. And I've had a couple students that I've had enough time and lessons with that I've actually been able to get pretty much the same solo every time. And I won't go into, there's a few coaching methods I use to try to make sure I get the same solo every time, but it's not that complicated. I've explained it to a few people. So then I have to know, the only other variable I have to know is how do they do in competitions? Do they tend to fall apart? Do they tend to be inconsistent? Do they tend to rise to the challenge? And kids have a natural predisposition to do any of those three things. Some kids naturally skate better in every competition. They're showmen, they're performers. Some kids naturally get a little nervous and skate worse in every competition. And probably the majority of kids just kind of skate the way they do in practice. So I know if they're averaging around here, in practice every day, that's what they're going to do in competition. And that's kind of what I'm looking for. You want to have predictability. You know, if you get them to a certain point in practice, you want it to be the exact same in competition. But every once in a while, you get a few that jump around, and you kind of know the average score is there, but if they skate particularly bad, they might be down around 8. And if they skate particularly good, they might actually get slightly above 10. And you have to, work in those probabilities and let them know. Generally, that margin of variance is very, very small, though. It's, like I said, with this skater, it was between 12 and 15. And usually it takes only a couple events to figure out whether you have a kid that naturally overperforms at competitions or underperforms. Now, that can be drastically influenced by the coach. By me, I guess I can put this away. That's totally affected by the coach. There are some coaches I know, most of whom don't coach for very long, who can't get their kids to perform even at their normal level, like competitions and test days under stress. They constantly underperform. And a lot of coaches just don't influence their psychological, emotional stability enough, and they tend to bounce all over the place. You never know what they're going to do. It's actually very few coaches, I only know of 2, who kind of positively influence all of their kids. Now, that being said, I had one kid, only one student ever out of my 200 or so students, who I could not, I never got quite the ice and lessons I wanted with her, but I got enough that I should have been able to get some kind of consistent performance out of her, and I never did. She would often, I don't think she skated well the last 4 years she skated with me. She did dances okay, she did skills okay, she did interpreter programs great, but she just, when you add the jumps in, she just couldn't hold it together. And, based on my record of 199 of my students doing well in competitions, I'd have to put that completely on her. Her psychology, her psychological makeup, but hi Nicole. But for the most part, if I have a kid that performs well, they're going to perform even better with me. If I have a kid that performs average, they're going to perform slightly above average with me. And if I have a kid that gets nervous and falls apart, I'm going to at least get them to be able to perform on average with me. This is one of my strengths as a coach. And I don't particularly know how I do it. I know other coaches complain bitterly about the way I treat my kids in competitions and performances. Not regularly, but I get side-handed comments and off-handed comments. And I did lose a student 2 years ago from coaches randomly commenting on how mean I was to my kids on test day. And this last, or competitions. And the last competition I just did, I was called mean by 2 different coaches, openly, to me, to my face, in front of my students, which is good professionalism there. And they were both clearly kind of joking, but I've been around skating long enough to know that there's a fair bit of substance and meaning behind the jokes. So I don't know what it is that I do that gets them to perform. I know I change my approach, my attitude, my speech, my demeanor, my mannerisms, depending on the kid, and I adjust a little bit from competition to competition. But I'm really not consciously aware of what I do to get my kids to perform well, which I think is one of the things that other coaches are confused about, because they can't see what I do to get my kids to perform well, and yet they do, over and over. And it's, I've had occasional comments from coaches saying, "Oh, your kids managed to all skate well this competition." No, not this competition. Every competition, every test day. For 20 years, my kids have skated well in competitions and test days. And there's a few times where I screwed up. I over-warmed up a couple kids, a couple early on in my skating. I've never under-warmed up anyone. And I've never said or done anything to my students that have freaked them out before they skate. I've actually occasionally tried to do that and failed, despite the fact that I'm mean. Anyway, so that once you figure out how they perform, you can generally guess every single competition what their score is going to be. And I'm basically right on every time. I usually give a range. This is, when I was in Labrador the last few years, I would have 7 or 8 kids doing CPC. And I would say your kid usually, we've done the solo, it's always between 15 and 18 points. Or I did another kid that was, 36 to 40 points. And I had one kid, Emily, who I was like, yeah, she should score 39. 39 at every competition, and she would through the whole year. There'd be slight variation, 38.5, 39.5, but she'd basically be exactly where I predicted her to be essentially in September for the entire year. So it's not impossible to figure out. Can I make this over 15 minutes? I don't know. Let's end it. Bye.